It's a real pleasure to welcome David Spencer. He is the founder and chairman of WTE, which stands for Waste to Energy Corporation. He has worked in the recycling field for over 35 years, designing and building refuse-to-energy plants, solid waste and sewage, sludge to plastic plants, mixed materials, recycling plants, and plants that specialize in the reclaiming of individual metals and plastics from trash and mixed recycling. He founded Ultra PET, located in Albany, New York, which recycles 7 million soda bottles per day for Coke and Pepsi, among other things, to reclaim soda bottles using closed-loop recycling. Other ventures in formation, largely funded by NSF, NIST, and DOE, are SpectraMet and MELT Cognition that apply X-rays and laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy to identify and sort mixed metals and alloys at ultra-high speeds. He has served on numerous NSF advisory boards, including its SBIR program, the Engineering Directorate, and Business and Operations Directorate, also chairing what's called the ACGPA, which oversaw performance of the entire NSF agency on behalf of the National Science Board and the Office of Management and Budget. He currently serves on the advisory board of MIT's new cross-disciplinary materials research laboratory. He was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 2014 and was cited for invention and entrepreneurship in materials manufacturing and recycling. He serves in various corporate boards and non-profit organizations with a major focus on education and in particular STEM education for women and underrepresented minorities. With that, David.
Thanks, David.
So you could probably just come over here. Yeah. I know it's a fantastic room.
So I probably have too many slides to cover in detail, but I'm chairman of really this company here, WTE Corporation, which originally stood for Waste to Energy Technology Corporation, a mouthful. And when we got out of the waste to energy business, we really just changed our name to WTE, which now stands for Work to Exhaustion, where we take everything. And our focus became a pure play in metals and plastics. And before starting WTE, which I formed in 1981, I worked for Raytheon, where we had a new division that we created, and I was like the only mining engineer in the entire company. And we focused on solving municipal problems, particularly solid waste, and built some very large waste processing facilities to generate steam, energy, electricity. And sort of that's where I sort of cut my teeth in technology, where we had some major projects from UPA to demonstrate technology, hopefully for rolling out long term. So, and then we have these other two subsidiaries. UltraPET, that's in Albany. It's a joint venture between our company and Tomra, which is a European company that builds these reverse vending machines, although we're the majority shareholder. And then SpectraMet, which is really a company that's currently in formation, aimed at using high-speed optoelectronics to sort materials very accurately. And you'll see that from the presentation, so let me move on. So formed in 1981, I think I've told you all this stuff. And we were venture-backed, Chase Amber, Advent International, and currently about $80 to $100 million a year in sales. Although we're not a household word, we're a privately held company, and we don't advertise. We pretty much, one of the things I'd say about recycling is it's sort of an upside-down business that you buy from a whole lot of people and you sell to a few. So if we're recycling PET plastics, we might have hundreds and hundreds of suppliers that we buy from. We might only have 5 customers that we sell to: Coke, Pepsi, Nestle, people like that. So, so what I wanted to say here, I could have shown a picture of a landfill, which would really give you a glaring view of gross national product. But instead I decided I'd throw this picture in of New Orleans, which is a little happier outlook on our waste issues. However, currently, everything that you see in that picture, the people, the buildings, the umbrellas, the beers, everything 50 years from now will certainly be in our solid waste stream. So almost everything that we do and have eventually becomes solid waste. We run an automobile shredder. We can shred a car a minute. We recycle all the materials from that, the non-ferrous metals, the ferrous metals. We recover the seat covers and all those kinds of things. But when I say we take everything, we really do take everything. In other words, most of the homeowners, when they're done with something, they put it out to the curb and it's goodbye. Okay, and most of the municipalities that pick that stuff up at the curb have somebody pick it up, you know, waste management, people like that, who are largely trucking companies. And then there has to be somebody behind that who's going to do the work of unscrambling that egg and then recovering the materials to a level that people can use. And I have to tell you that in today's manufacturing community, it's not good enough to be 98% pure in most applications. So when we're recycling PET bottles, we're talking about 6/9 purity, okay, color separated, in order for Coke and Pepsi to take that. And if we ever had one batch or one dirty pallet that infiltrated that bottle that would create a problem with our FDA approval or with Coke or Pepsi from a liability standpoint, it's game over. You know, you never get a second chance to coming back in the door. So the problem is not just developing technologies that work and work most of the time. They have to work all of the time. And when they're separating products, there has to be multiple levels of quality control to make sure that these products, before they go back into the food and beverage supply, that when you go running and you're carrying the bottle and it's got 20% of our recycled PET in it, you know, we've got to be comfortable that it's every bit as good as the virgin material that's being purchased to make that PET bottle out of ethylene glycol, etc. So I think I've covered that. You know, today's GMP is tomorrow's waste. And I think the perspective on waste, I think, you know, I deal with environmentalists really from both sides. I mean, you know, we serve them and we're criticized by them. And what I think I would say is that the amount of waste that we generate, it's really a good thing because it's a sign of a really strong economic economy. I mean, when your children go out and buy toys, when you get them presents for Christmas, that's all an indicator that you're able to do a lot more for your children than some poor family in South America, you know, who's putting together a doll out of straw. And the downside of that is that for my kids, sometimes the toy's trash before it even gets home. And when it does get home, it's not that much longer before it's replaced by another toy and so forth. But to some degree, it's really an indication of the wonder of living in America and having personal wealth and being able to share that with your family that then comes into being material goods or helping other people who are less fortunate so that they can have the same kind of life that we have. So I don't look at waste as a problem, I look at it as an opportunity, and it's a good thing for us to recycle, and I'll talk about the economics of that. But I think it's an indicator of a healthy economy, and I think we need to remember that. Okay, so a lot of people talk about, reduce, recycle, reuse, and the hierarchy. But we have to remember that the packaging materials that we have are really critical to, who wants to buy a TV that's delivered in a paper bag that's been scratched and dropped off the truck and sitting on your door in pieces? The packaging costs a heck of a lot less than the TV, and it has a lot to do with making sure that that's delivered and received in a condition that you really want to actually take it. So it's important. And the other thing that it does is it provides for safety. I mean, who wants to buy drugs, that are just sort of like, poured out on a countertop and maybe mixed in with other drugs? I mean, you want to know that it's packaged. You want to have labels on it that indicate what's in it, what the issues are. Packaging has a lot to do with that, and it provides convenience. I mean, you know, we can all use you know, a glass when we're running, as opposed to water in a PET bottle. But it's nice to have the bottle with the lid on it, basically, so that as you're running, you can take a drink of water and then keep running your marathon. We produce a lot of waste. On the average, each of us in America produces about 4.5 pounds per day, and that would be parents, children, and so forth. And that begins to add up. So, and those numbers have been growing. So, so as you can see here, in 1960, okay, we were at about 90 million tons. And you know, it's hard to conceptually understand what 90 million tons of waste looks like. You know, I mean, I didn't calculate how many Packer trucks that would be and how it would go around from the Earth to the Moon and back every year of, you know, Packer trucks of waste, but it's a lot. Okay, and that number has been growing. Was 220 million tons in 2000. Right now, it's about a quarter of a billion tons a year of waste is generated, and that's just municipal solid waste. That excludes mining waste. That excludes industrial waste, commercial waste. We're just talking about residential waste that homeowners dispose of, and you know, 50 million tons of plastics. And then when you look at iron ore and so forth, it's a lot higher. So it's a big problem. It's also a big opportunity. This chart sort of shows the increase in waste generation over time, generated by the EPA. And you can see that things have sort of leveled out at about 250 million tons a year. And the reason for that is recycling. So you can also see that as the waste generation leveled out, in part it was because recycling started to take a significant turn in the mid-1980s and has been growing ever since. And a large part of that, Amit was good enough to go over, you know, all the things that you're looking at Renew, and I know part of what your program here is the messaging, if you will, or the branding of, you know, helping communities understand what the right thing to do is, and helping, especially our children, understand how to deal with what we're going to have to deal with in terms of sustainability. And hopefully that they'll also understand that it's not all about the money. It's all about having a sustainable life here on Earth. And when we talk at the National Academy of Engineering about the grand challenges, you know, whether you know it or not, those grand challenges are really those things that need to be addressed and done for life to be sustainable on Earth. I mean, that was the focus there. You know, water, energy, preserving land resources, etc. And so these are things that we need to have as a mission focus. And I think as we take our personal wealth, if we don't use that personal wealth to do the right things, then at some point in time, it may be too late. And of course, you're certainly all dealing with that in terms of this issue of global warming. And I have to be critical of the National Academy. You know, I think on the global warming thing, there was a huge initiative by the government to get moving on that in the mid-70s. And it really came back to the NAE to write a report for Congress, which was pretty much non-definitive. And now they're doing another report that's very definitive, but at the time, those who didn't want to spend the money to take the initiatives used that report as a basis to say, look, we don't really have to do anything, we have time, it's not a big problem. So if we're going to solve that problem, probably most of you aren't as old as I am, but I remember when I was a little kid, we used to string up tin cans and make them into telephones. But that's not going to solve our solid waste problem. We're not going to get to 250 million tons a year by making telephones for our kids to play with. And this is something that if there's one takeaway that I could leave you with, it would be this one. So like when I was a kid, my mother used to darn my socks. How many people here have either darned socks for their children? That's really quite amazing. And the reason that it's amazing is that what's happened here is that the cost of manufacture of socks, because of automation and because of low-cost materials and infrastructure, has come down to the point that economically, darning of socks might be a good thing. It may not necessarily be the best way to use your time, but it probably brings certain other good feelings to you. But but where the cost of socks is now down to 39 cents a pair, you have to ask yourself, or you don't have to, but you could ask yourself, is this really what I want to do now? And so it's not so much that the recycling value of it's not so much that there's been a production cycle such that the reduction of the competitive materials has come down so low that the recycling is or the darning, if you want to call it that, may not make economic sense. And when you're a community or when you're a business, you're sort of asked to be the steward of other people's money, and you sort of have an obligation to look very seriously at the economic consequences of your decisions. And so if we can't do recycling in our company, WTE, that we make money at, or at least break even on, we're not really stewarding the funds that people have given to us, and those funds are going to dry up. They're going to go to somebody else. So, and the same thing's true with our municipalities. If they're not careful about watching their dollars, they're going to be, the people who are the city managers are going to be replaced. So, so to some degree, it's about the money. And if it isn't, then there has to be a subsidizer who decides that, okay, it doesn't make economic sense. And after all, one of the purposes of government is to do the things that don't make economic sense or that won't be done if it's not done by government. Okay, so recycling advantages, I think everybody knows this stuff. I mean, there are huge energy savings on aluminum. It takes 5% of the energy to recycle aluminum as it does to make aluminum out of bauxite through mining operations. And the same goes for all of those other materials, 80% for plastics. And the benefits are not only in terms of energy savings, but also air pollution. So, I mean, when we were running, big diesel engines to run our automobile shredders, we were oftentimes pushed with respect to the environmental requirements for, let's say, sulfur dioxide. And the way that you control sulfur dioxide in operating those engines is you untune them so that they run almost in a stall condition. And that brings the SO2 production down, but it drives the CO2 production up. Well, it wasn't that long ago, nobody really cared about CO2. The fact that we're breathing, nobody cared. The CO2 just wasn't such a big deal. People might have worried about other greenhouse gases like methane and so forth, but not so much CO2. Well, now CO2 is on our agenda, isn't it? And so now we really have much more complex environmental decisions to make. But clearly doing this recycling certainly generates far fewer air emissions than making these materials from the raw material. So how did recycling used to be done? Well, this is a picture of recycling in England, where they get bones and hair and shoes and rework those things and spend a lot of time at it. And those were the days when manufacturing wasn't what it was today, so that was cost effective. And people made a living collecting stuff from around where they lived and worked, and putting them back into the economy, and this is around 1870. You know, two things have happened. Some of these things aren't worth anything. You know, we have a lot of, I mean, that kind of collection you would think would not make sense, and would be very hard to manage in our current economy with OSHA regulations, etc. So how do we do it today? It hasn't really changed a hell of a lot as far as I can see. So China and India have been taking in from the United States, so, you know, essentially they'll ship goods over, they'll have an empty haul back, so they can haul the material back essentially for free, or just send back an empty container. Or they can put low-grade materials in that container, and even trash in that container, take those back, and then what they can do is they can essentially have a tax system that incentivizes buying low-cost materials. So instead of buying copper, ingot, or brass, or whatever, they buy sort of trashy materials, employ a lot of people who previously weren't employed, and then take these low-grade materials and put them into, you know, a new lamp, a new bicycle, or whatever, and sell it back to America. And so we developed technology to sort these materials automatically. And so if you think about the economics of how that would work, you'd have your capital cost, you would have your labor, and you would have your operating costs and your shipping costs. And the prices that China was paying for the sorted material, or really the world market, because China was controlling that because there was such a large buyer of metals and so plastics and so forth, that the price that they were paying for the mixture of, I'll call it, low-cost recyclables all together, you know, the scrambled egg, they were paying more money for the scrambled egg than what we could buy. They were paying more for that than the market value of the unscrambled egg. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, if you took all the metals and the paper and the plastics and you rolled them all up into a big trash ball, they would pay more for the trash ball than for the individual products that could be recovered from it. Okay, so that created a negative incentive to operate automated recycling operations here in the United States. So I don't know about how many of you are involved with it. How many of you are with communities that do recycling? And just out of, well, I can't ask these questions because I don't have time, but for a long time, China really, we had, Weyerhaeuser was in the paper business. There were a bunch of other people who were doing paper recycling and recycling paper into various grades, and those were businesses that were running economically. China essentially, over a period of 10 years, ran all of them out of business because they were overpaying for the recycled materials more than they were worth, really, here in the United States. And so now Weyerhaeuser and all those other players in the paper business, they're gone. And so what's happened? Once China decided within the last year and a half, that they were going to stop taking all this trash into their country, okay, now that's all backed up in the United States. There are no buyers for that material right now, and there are no plants to recycle it, and the infrastructure is all gone. And those companies, now that their businesses have gone under, are not very anxious to get back into the business again just because China changed its mind. So it's becoming a community problem. And in my community, those recyclable materials, I think right now, even though our city manager might not say so, they're probably either going to a waste-to-energy plant, where they're being converted into energy, or they're just going to landfill or going into composting. Because the markets are gone, except in very specialized markets for cardboard, corrugated, and high-grade paper. So let's talk about strategy as we teach our children about recycling. You know, I talk about our revenues in the company, you know, between $75 and $100 million. Well, we can be $100 million one year and be processing 75% of the material. That the next year we increase the amount of material, but the pricing drops and our revenues are lower. If you follow what I'm saying, let's say if we we're doing 100 tons, it's so much a ton, and the pricing is really high. Then we do 200 tons, but the pricing's low. Our total revenues go down, and our margins go down in a falling market. So I think what we need to understand conceptually when we're doing recycling as communities and as individuals and as teaching our children is that these things are cyclical. If you want to build a business that stays in business, you have to have an economic model that doesn't only survive during the peak markets, but that either involves savings to cover the low markets or subsidies during those low markets. You can't be starting and stopping and starting and stopping when you have a bunch of employees hired, you have capital employed and so forth. So we need to think about recycling not just of how well it works in the good times, but we need to think about it in a sustainable sense over long times, over the ranges of market pricing that we see over time. So if I were in your shoes and I'm doing economic models, I would not be doing, just picking the high prices. And I might not be picking the average. Well, let's say I'm not sure what I'd be picking, but I'd certainly be making sure that in that model there was sustainability of the operations, so that in the bad times the expectations were consistent with the reality. And oftentimes when the environmental folks are selling a project, the expectations are set too high. And so people get sucked in on economic expectations, and then when the reality hits, they're not there in those bad times, and it sort of leaves a bad taste. Okay, so that's the assembly line version. And these are things that I've been saying to you right now, which is that companies can bring the technology, but you can lose a little money for a long time or a lot of money for a short time, but nobody will lose a lot of money for a long time. And so it has to be a viable business, and if it's not viable, then there has to be a public commitment to covering the bad times. Okay, enough of philosophy. So, you've seen the hand picking part. So now let's just talk for a moment about automation. So, as I said, I was a mining engineer at the Missile Systems Division. There weren't many of us, just me. And but these are some of the technologies that we use in mining, and I don't know how for sorting materials and where material science is going this day. And even if you look at the National Academy, who in the National Academy is a mining engineer or a minerals engineer? I mean, it's like nobody. It's like soft materials. It's like advanced materials. All nanotechnology. There's this steel making and basic open hearts and all the kind of stuff that produces our metals and our plastics and so forth. They're really not there, basically. But so we all know how magnetic separation works, right? We're familiar with that. And we all know how screens work. So if you want to get dirt and glass away from paper, you screen it, right? But the paper can sort of plug the screen, so you put it into a rotary screen so things tumble over and you have access. Air classifiers, we all, when something, when a feather lands on our hand, we blow it off. And same thing when we shred a car and you have seat covers and you have cushions and you have what we'll do after we shred it and take the car down to fist-sized pieces, we then put it into air classifiers, which blow off the light paper and plastic. That goes, let's say, to a landfill as landfill cover material. And then what's left is going to be the heavy non-ferrous metals, the ferrous metals, and wood, heavy plastics. And then we use a system called eddy current separation. How many people know what eddy current separation is? Okay, so let me just give you a quick lecture. So eddy currents are kind of like magnets for non-ferrous material, except they don't work by attraction, they work by repulsion. And so what you do is you induce an alternating magnetic, you provide an alternating magnetic field, and it generates a secondary electrical field within a conductor. And that secondary field has a secondary magnetic field associated with it that always opposes the primary field. So when you run non-magnetic materials over these highly oscillating generators, if you want to think of it, it's kind of like a motor laid out. What happens is the metals sort of pop off the conveyor and can be separated away from non-conductors such as wood and plastic and things like that. So we do that to concentrate the conductors from the other waste materials that are in the materials that we're trying to process. How many people know what froth flotation is? Same guys. Excuse me, same people. So yeah, so in froth flotation, you'd be surprised, is in huge demand in the mineral industry, because what you essentially do is after you liberate the minerals from the ore, from the rock, you're left with areas of concentrated minerals, and then you put, I'll say, chemicals into the bath and blow bubbles through it, and it essentially selectively changes the surface energy of the minerals relative to the tailing of the waste materials. And they attach themselves to the bubbles and float to the top. And so that's how you separate one mineral from the gangue or from the other material that lies behind. How about heavy media separation? Anybody here familiar with that? Okay, heavy media separation is, so aluminum has a density of 3 grams per cc, and copper would be about 8 grams per cc. And so with, most of the other aluminum's pretty light along with magnesium. And so if you create a synthetic fluid that has an apparent density of, let's say, 3.5 grams per cc, then the aluminum will float, and all the other materials, the copper and the zinc and the brass and bronze and all those things, will drop out. And so you've separated now the aluminum from what we call the other mixed heavy non-ferrous metals, and now you have an aluminum stream, and you've pulled that away. And when you're dealing with a car, there's a lot more aluminum than there is brass, bronze. There is a fair amount of zinc and so forth. But now you've gotten roughly 80% of the aluminum away from the 20% of the heavier materials. And then you can begin to sort those heavier materials using, let's say, optoelectronics, which I'm going to talk about. And you can even sort the aluminum materials into cast and wrought, or by alloy, with really exciting technologies like laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy is part of what we're using, or some very sophisticated X-ray techniques. So in addition then to these, I call these sort of the mass migration techniques. All the magnetics go this way, all the heavies go this way, all the conductors go this way. Whereas this automated stuff, it's not a mass migration technique. We're actually looking at the exact chemical composition of the material, and we're doing it in milliseconds. And then we're deciding, based on that composition, which way we want it to go, or into which bin. So I call that the she loves me not. I mean, we see this happening all around us, right? I mean, with the 4th Industrial Revolution and sensors and everything, all the things that we used to do kind of in a dumb mass migration technique, we're getting better and better at doing. This is buzzing. Is my time up? No?
It's outside.
What's that?
It's noise from outside.
Oh, okay. So, so we're moving into high-speed optoelectronics, and into she loves me not, on sortation. Now, I'm going to divert for a moment, because you probably haven't been in the recycling field, or most of you haven't been, and we all talk about recycling, but when you really get into it, everybody's idea of recycling is very different. It's based on what they do or what they've seen. So I just want to say, clearly in New York you have bottle bills, right? We handle, in fact, every soda bottle that you drink, we get. Whenever you return that bottle to anybody, to the beverage, to get your 5 cents back, or to a materials recycling facility, I guarantee you it's going to our plant in Albany to be recycled. And deposits would cover glass, usually aluminum, and then PET. So you have drop-off centers. They're mostly in California. I don't think I've seen too many of those in New York. curbside recycling, you know, you put it out to the curb. I'll show you some pictures of these things. And then what happens is, when these things are picked up, if they're all mixed together, then you either have to hand sort them or you have to have a materials recycling facility, a MRF, that does that automatically using some combination of technologies. And a front-end resource recovery facility, or the kind of plants we built when I worked at Raytheon, would take literally all the trash in the packer truck and recover from that the glass, the ferrous metals, the non-ferrous metals, and produce a refuse-derived fuel, the light material, that would be co-fired. It was co-fired in a suspension-fired boiler at Rochester Gas and Electric. And then you have what's called boilers, like at Rochester Gas and Electric. They were firing coal in suspension and firing in refuse-derived fuel as a supplementary fuel. The other thing you can do is build special boilers that burn this to generate energy from nothing but the refuse-derived fuel from municipal solid waste. And then mass burn is when you take everything that's in the packer truck, everything you put out to the curb, and you just dump it onto a big grate, a traveling grate. Think of it as like your fireplace, but it's traveling. And you blow air through it, you light the thing off, you control the combustion, and then you recover the energy from it. Now I'll just give you a quick run through on some of these things. So our partner, Tomra, makes these reverse vending machines. Do you have them
Yes.
here?
Yeah.
Okay, so what they're doing there is you're putting the bottle in there, it's reading the barcode. And then what it's doing is it's assigning the return money to Coke or Pepsi or Canada Dry or whoever it is that was the bottler, if you will. And in order to distribute those funds for what's returned. And then when they're done, they have, basically shredded PET, they have, flattened cans, and they have broken glass that they then deliver this material to us. We take all this material from all over the country, really. And then, and somebody else takes the cans and glass. Okay, so, that's what they do in California. You actually go to the supermarket, basically, and you return all this stuff. And then you have curbside collection. And I don't know how many of you did it like this, where a truck would go around with multiple compartments and would pick up all these things. And the problem was, we actually operated that business for a while. The problem is, as soon as one compartment is full, even if the others are only half full, then you have to go back and dump everything and then start collecting again. And whether you know it or not, collection is one of the largest costs of recycling. So people have gone to commingled recycling, where all of the non-paper products are put in a single container. And now we're going to something called single stream, because we have optoelectronics to sort paper and corrugated away from the other plastic materials. And we do that in MRFs, materials recycling facilities. So that's the kind of material that would be generated from some of those collection things. And this is a plant in, this is in Wilmington, Delaware. And just to say that there are automobile shredders, there are air classifiers, there are rotary drum air classifiers, magnets, eddy currents, all kinds of things to take that garbage, basically, liberate the materials that are combined together in a single product, and then separate them based on the nature of the material. And this is the one in Rochester, New York. Oh, I won't get into it. But it was a very large refuse-derived fuel recycling plant, and for a number of different reasons having to do with railroads and crew changes and power agreements, it worked technically, but it didn't work economically. And if we have time and questions and answers, I could tell you about that. And then this is one in Wilmington, Delaware, same thing, except there were also anaerobic digestion facilities that took the refuse-derived fuel with sewage sludge and generated compost. This is Akron, Ohio. We operated this for 15 years. And we had 3 waste-fired boilers that generated steam for the downtown, so we maintained 18 miles of steam lines. And as I was telling you, Amit, Akron University, even though they had their own coal-fired boilers, we provided all of their heating requirements, so long as we were economically competitive with their coal-fired units. And heated all the hospitals and businesses in the downtown. And then we also had, and you can sort of see this, I don't know if you can see this diagram, is that too small for you to see? But in any event, I guess I'll just try to show you. So these were the 3 waste-fired boilers, and the trash would come into this building here, and then it would be sorted so that the burnable stuff would go into this big storage bin, be fed into the boilers. The ferrous metals would be recovered here, and then we would produce steam for this 18-mile steam loop, and we also produced chilled water and hot water and electricity to meet our internal power requirements, and that was basically how the system worked. Okay, so it was really a pretty neat facility, and I'll tell you, one of the things that happened with that, and it also happened, that was 1,000 tons a day of trash that we took in, and also tires. We co-fired, Akron being the tire capital, we co-fired shredded tires with refuse-derived fuel. And the environmentalists made a big pitch on dioxin emissions. How many of us have heard about dioxins? And the dioxin emissions, in my opinion, is really a phony argument, basically. The dioxin emissions from these plants were grams per year. And however, there was a technical argument made of the health impacts. And there was a huge dioxin spill in Seveso, Italy, that was way, way, way higher. And the only outcome from that was chloracne. I know you're shaking your head, so you're probably familiar with this. And so we're looking right now at probably 35-year health impacts of a huge dioxin spill in Seveso, Italy, where, again, there was chloracne. And Carol Browner viewed dioxin as the most poisonous chemical known to man. Okay, and then there were theories about how it wasn't poisonous in high concentrations, but in low concentrations was cancer producing. And so there were some theoretical analyses about how that all worked, which I think were completely untrue. And there was never any peer review studies on any of that work. And that became where we went. And so Region 5 of EPA closed down every waste-to-energy plant in Ohio because of dioxin emissions. And these plants had air emission control equipment on them, 3-stage, 4-stage electrostatic precipitators, but that wasn't good enough. They had to go to dry acid gas scrubbing. And so in every one of those plants, Columbus, for example, was looking at a $125 million community paid improvement to switch over from 4-stage electrostatic precipitators to dry acid gas scrubbing. And they just couldn't do it. They couldn't finance it. Or didn't want to finance it. And so that plant closed, they went back to landfill. Akron, Ohio, same thing. They couldn't afford the emission upgrade, closed it, so that plant's closed. And they did the same thing in Dayton, and so now everything's going back to landfill, where all the emissions are completely unregulated, unmanaged. It's just amazing to me what we do to ourselves on bad science. So I wish you were here then and doing these studies peer-reviewed to sort of counteract some of these things. This is you have a Wheelabrator plant, or no, you have a Covanta plant here.
Yes.
It's mass burning, where all the trash comes out of the Packer trucks. And they do have dry acid gas scrubbing on those plants. This is a 3,000 ton per day plant in Alexandria, Virginia. I presume it does the same things that yours does. And they have very sophisticated emission control equipment for mercury recovery and all kinds of different things, and dioxin control. Okay, so what I've just done is I've talked to you about the way that recyclables and trash is collected and the kinds of technologies that are used to try to separate it. And I've talked about kind of the different technologies that try to get the energy out of our trash and our recyclables and so forth. So now I'm going to talk about individual streams in terms of the processing that is done once it goes back to the recycling center, or it goes to waste management and they take it to a MRF or whatever. So paper, paper really is not very recyclable when it's been mixed in with the trash. And the reason is because it picks up all of the fluids and the odors and the glass and all these things adhere to it. And so when they then put it into what are called hydropulpers to recover it, either they run very inefficiently, or they can't make decent grade paper. So like if you, so there are probably about 130 different grades of paper. So you can have magazine, rotogravure, you can have news, you can have mixed news, you can have, you know how they, with rotogravure, you know how you see these magazine sections and they're shiny and the pictures are really clear, you know how they get that? They actually embed clay into the paper, and then they print on that clay paper mixture, and you get a nice picture out of that. But the problem is when you're trying to recycle that, now you've got all this clay that you've got to deal with that from a water treatment standpoint almost can become a problem. So most people who are buying mix, or in the days when the people were were in business in the US, buying recycled news from homeowners and everything, there was always a limit on the amount of rotogravure that could be in there in order to keep that material marketable. And then there were other limitations as well. So they couldn't be sun bleached because that breaks down the fibers. Moisture, they didn't want to pay for moisture the way they were paying for paper, so moisture had to be controlled. And they didn't want to buy paper mache, they wanted to buy clean, dry paper. And paper's valued based on the length of the fiber. So or sometimes it can be the color and the purity. So if you get a corrugated box, they hold stuff, they're hard to rip, they have a lot of strength to them. And the way they get that strength is that they have long fibers. And when they make non-woven, they're essentially making non-woven fiber products, which is the corrugated. And the longer the fibers, the stronger the corrugated. So that's a very valuable product. But you also have seen probably these boxes that, if it rains on your front step and it came from China in one of these yellowish corrugated boxes, it just about falls apart on your doorstep, okay? So that's the Chinese corrugated, which has very short fibers in it. And pizza boxes are kind of, you can also almost like co-extrude corrugated. So if you have dirty material, you can kind of like put it on the inside. You can do the same thing with plastics, co-extruded plastics. So you put the sort of dirty stuff on the inside, and then you put a good sheet of white paper on top, and then you print on top Joe's Pizza, and maybe you have clean underneath, or maybe you don't. Maybe that's sort of the lower grade. And so if you look at your tablets, on the back of your, if anybody, you have a tablet, right? On the back of your tablet, if you look at that material, hold that up for a second. Okay, so that's the kind of product, that's about the only kind of product you can make out of mixed news. You can either make that, and oftentimes when you look at that, you'll see little bits of plastic in it sometimes and so forth. Maybe not anymore because it might have been made a little bit differently, but in some cases, those products, they serve a good purpose, and the recyclable mixed news can be used in that or used as a filler in other materials, but very few of us buy anything that you can make out of mixed news. But if you're selling white paper, you can make a really good product out of that that has a very high value. So anyhow, not all paper is recyclable, and most paper recyclables haven't been recycled yet. They haven't come back online since the China disaster. Glass. So when you go to the store and you buy Canada Dry and Pepsi, if you get it in a glass container, or beer, flint or clear, emerald or green, amber or brown, we know that. So the people who recycle those bottles, a lot of homeowners think that they should take the label off and take the cap off. No. Our plants are built to handle all that stuff. So if you spend a lot of water removing paper labels and removing the caps, you're really wasting resources, because we have to presume that those labels are there, that the glue is there, that the caps are there. And so our processing systems are really built to handle that. Now the thing you don't want to do is you don't want to throw crystal or ceramic plates in with your glass. Anybody know why? Okay, so most...
Heavy metals like clay?
No, not really. Although that, I can see why you would say that. But no, the real reason is, you know what eutectics are? I mean, those of you who are so most of these materials are a mixture of calcium oxide, magnesium oxide, aluminum oxide, blah, blah, blah. And when you mix all those things together, the melting point lowers, right? So these things individually have very high melting points. But when you mix them together, if you know what a eutectic diagram is, the melting points begin to drop as they blend together. So the good thing about recycled glass is that it's already pre-melted and has a much lower melting point and a much lower energy requirement than the raw materials like silica sands and so forth that would go into making glass. But the problem is that if that glass bottle, if you're shooting, if you're blowing bottles at the rate of 36 bottles a second on a blow, or every 2 seconds on a blow molding machine, and you have pieces of ceramic in there that have very high melting points, let's say 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, and everything else is melted at 1,500, has a softening point, if you want to call it that, of 1,500, then those little things, they don't melt in the time frames that they're in the furnace, and so they form what are called stones. And the stones are stress risers in the glass, so when you pressurize the glass and you put it on the shelf, it blows up. And that's not a good thing. The supermarkets don't want any of Pepsi's or Canada Dry's bottles blowing up on the shelf because they have these stress concentration points as a result of stones. So you have to meet very close specifications on those kind of ceramic materials. You can only have, let's say, 12 particles per million of materials larger than 12 mesh, if that means that's screen size designations. So that can be issues. Color can be an issue. So if you're making clear, clearly whenever you separate things, you never do a perfect separation. So you want to make sure that you get a lower yield of a pure material, let's say to make the flint clear glass, and then what you miss in flint, you kind of put into brown and green, because you can sort of average that out, and it's still brown. But if you put brown into clear, it's going to be light brown. So that doesn't work too well in the marketplace. Okay, and why don't people use glass today, and why are they using plastic? That's it, transportation. So if you put it in a heavy glass container, you can't, all these trucks are loaded to the transportation weight limit. And so you can't get as much soda to market because you're moving all this wasted glass weight around. And so you can only get, let's say, 85% of the payload to the customer per shipment. And then the second reason is that the product isn't worth a lot. So if bottles were made out of gold, everybody would recycle all of them, right? It'd be no problem. When the bottles are made out of something that's not worth very much money, like glass, you can only transport it 50 to 125 miles. So if you're in Ohio and Owens Corning is within 100 miles of you, then glass recycling makes sense. If you're in Nevada, glass recycling doesn't make any sense because you can't afford to cost effectively transport it to the nearest glass plant. Okay. This is glass recycling, plastics. So this is 1 through 7, right? We all kind of know what those are. And I would tell you that every one of these materials is recyclable. And so it's really, one of the things I hate about our industries is that we really are dishonest in the marketing of what we do. So people put recyclable on their PVC containers, or and theoretically they're recyclable, but nobody takes them. Okay, or if you take LDPE, you take film, HDPE film plastics. Okay, they're recyclable, but there's nobody who recycles it. And the latest thing is straws. Does anybody recycle straws? I don't know a single plant in the world that recycles straws, and I don't really understand quite what we're doing. I would tell you that with respect to polystyrene, we teamed with 8 oil and chemical companies to build polystyrene recycling facilities in an organization called the National Polystyrene Recycling Corporation, NPRC. and Exxon and Mobil and Union Carbide and Amoco Farm Products and a number, Mobil, all pitched in $35 million, which would probably be $100 million today, to build 4 plants, one in Philadelphia, one in Chicago, one in San Francisco. We operated San Francisco, and one in LA. And so we were recycling polystyrene. And the idea was that we were going to preserve, remember McDonald's had the clamshells that were made out of polystyrene? Okay, and the environmentalists hated that material. And but McDonald's, those trays were a big part of the polystyrene demand, probably 30% or something like that on a national basis. And the rest of it were the peanuts, for shipping, and the polystyrene packages that your television comes in, and food trays at school systems, as well as some industrial polystyrene. So the idea was we'd collect all these materials around these major centers in the United States, and we'd bring them in, and we would essentially get the air out, because polystyrene is really polystyrene plus CO2, right? A lot of this stuff is foamed. Some of it's not, though. The crinkly packages that you get your Burries in, those are polystyrene. Most of them are. Some are PET. So the idea was we'll recycle that polystyrene. Well, the Environmental Defense Fund began to push on McDonald's and say, this is really bad stuff, and we can't have this anymore. And McDonald's kept pushing back for about 1.5 years. And then finally the president of McDonald's said, look, these are our customers. If they want us to do this, we're going to do it. So what did they do? Well, they eliminated the polystyrene package. All of the major players who were building these polystyrene plants just threw their arms up in the air, gave up. All those plants have been closed. And so McDonald's came out with a plastic-coated paper package that is totally non-recyclable, okay? In other words, to keep the heat in, now they've removed the plastic coating, so it doesn't keep the heat in like it used to. But they came out with that package, and so instead of their packages being recycled, they became recyclable, but not really. And nobody, I don't think anyone has ever recycled one of those packages back into the marketplace since the Environmental Defense Fund declared victory. And I see these things happen, it's just like the dioxin thing. I see these things happen all the time. We're not such a big company that we can really influence thinking. But you and universities can do that because of your independence. But oftentimes we go just with the best of intentions, we move in the wrong directions. So that's my polystyrene story that I was going to save for the end. This is the way, these are cans. Aluminum cans here. You don't even need to bale them, because when you compress them with high density balers, they just form a square bale and they don't fall apart until you shred them with like an automobile shredder. And then this is, these are PET here. And the PET, you can see it's all mixed color. You've got labels, you've got caps. And here you can see high density polyethylene milk jugs. Which is a very valuable product. And basically, that's about it. Other than ferrous, those are the materials for which there are markets for the end products right now. And I'll just go through that with you a little bit. And we handle, like I say, 7 million bottles a day of the PET material. This is polyethylene stuff that you buy. The polyethylene markets are real. It's not very complex technology, and we sort of moved to the PET because we wanted, more barriers to entry from competition, and also polyethylene has a much more fluctuating market. But we did a project on polyethylene recycling at Dow Chemical, and it worked and everything, but we never really wanted to commercialize it, and they didn't either, so we didn't do it with them. This is something that almost makes me laugh. We did a project on trying to recycle automobile plastics, which is very difficult. And we were working with the national. I'm done.
What? Another 5 minutes, perhaps.
Okay. Yeah. I really can't tell you that story. I'd like to, but I don't have time. So, but anyway, it's kind of a hoax to talk about. We take the PET bottles from our plant and put them into cars. Yeah, but, and so how much material is that? It's almost like this PET in the sea that they collected. I looked at the numbers that they brought back. I think they said that they brought back something like 3,001 cubic yard bales or bags of material. I mean, that's like 2 hours of our production. I mean, how could you make a business out of farming the material from the sea and recycling? I mean, you want to build a subsidized business, yes. But if you want to build a commercial business, I mean, we're processing 4,100 cubic yard trucks a day of baled plastics to get to 7 million bottles. And we are just on the edge economically. How can some of these other things even begin to work economically without huge subsidies? And the collection costs would be enormous, but the environmental benefits can be high if you remove these things. Anyway, I could talk about cars and all. These are some plastic plants. This is the polystyrene plant that we built in San Francisco that was eventually closed, called Certified Polymer Processors. But it closed after McDonald's jumped out. You know, we use optical sortation. When you look at a PET bottle, you know, you have a label, you have a cap. How do you know you're looking at PET? How do you know whether it's, you know, it's green or, you know, because the label can be green and the bottle can be white, you know. And so it has to be a pretty intelligent sensor system to detect these things at very high speeds that are mixtures of a lot of different colors and designs, and then make sure that you're separating green from clear. Again, processing plants. This is a little bit of a thing. If you take a PET bottle and you crush it, where it's thin, it just crushes, right? But the cap is thick, right? Where you screw the cap on. And so chips form. And when we do PET, we can only have one. PVC and PET look the same, except PET has gas barrier properties. That's why they use it for soda bottles, and why they don't want to use it for water, but they do because of the recyclability. So when you when you crush the cap, it breaks into chips. And if we get one PVC chip in 500,000 PET chips, we miss our specification with Coke and Pepsi. Okay, so we have to downgrade that into engineered resins or into fiber that goes into shirts or upholstery. These sorters use X-rays to look at the bottle, and they do 10,000 chips a second, and they do 10 measurements on each chip to decide if it's PVC or PET, to get the PET away, or to get the PVC away from the PET chips. So there is technology out there with sensing this using X-rays because, you know, PVC fluoresces, like diamonds fluoresce. So, you know, so then we produce either flake or pellet, and that's the kind of stuff we sell to bottlers. And I won't talk about these issues, except I will tell you this, the same thing is true. Everybody says a PET bottle is a single resin bottle, right? Anybody ever hear that? You know, PET is a single resin bottle, so it's easy to recycle. So it's got a cap on it that's either aluminum or polypropylene or polyethylene. It's got a liner in it, that blue liner that sometimes is used for promotional value. That's ethyl vinyl acetate. The cap, I said, could be aluminum. And then you have a label that can be shrink fit polyethylene. It can be glued on polypropylene. It can be aluminized paper. So you have paper and 3 other resins, plus you have the glues to deal with. And then sometimes they have bottom cups if they haven't molded it properly, and so you'll have the polyethylene bottom cup. So you've got PVC, PET, polypropylene, polyethylene, aluminum, and ethyl vinyl acetate. That's the single polymer bottle that we have to take in and make to 6 nines pure. Okay, and so, but what I would tell you is don't bother removing the labels and the caps, because we do all that automatically, and we have water treatment systems for zero discharge and all those kinds of things, although we never get to zero. And so it's much more efficient for you not to spend do rinse out the bottle a little bit if you want to, but you don't have to. But if it's full of fluid, that's not great, because nobody wants to pay for that wasted fluid like it was PET. And we buy the material at 20 cents a pound or whatever. Okay, I'm not going to talk. I'm done. I'll just go through these quickly. plants. These are refuse dry fuel plants. That's the ferrous metal. It's 50% paper and plastic, and so our job is to get it into ferrous metal and get the paper and plastic back to the power plant. And this is from a mass burn plant like the one you have here, and we take all that material from the Northeast, and it's 50% ash and 50% metal, and our job is to get the ash away from the metal and then sell the metal and return the ash to a ash monofilm. And then these are the kinds of things we produce that we either ship by truck or 10 rail cars a day, a finished product coming out of the plant. And these are the non-ferrous metals, which the Chinese are not going to sort because you can't tell one from the other once all the ash is in them. But if you use optoelectronics and you use X-rays, then those things that visually look the same could be identified and sorted. And we have some technologies to do that. This is an eddy current separator, and here you can see the materials jumping off the belt. They just pop right off the belt. And so you give them a forward trajectory with a conveyor, you pop them up in the air, and then the stuff that's not magnetic goes a short distance, and the magnetic stuff that's been lifted goes across the splitter and is sorted. And I mean, this is something we talked about over dinner last night. I mean, if you're going to do something, if you just make a small incremental change, by the time you've made it, efficiencies will have caught up with you, and you won't have a business. So you really have to think way out there about things that people think can't be done, and then do them, that are going to really make a difference. So what we wanted to do with metals was do the same stuff we do with plastics. But the plastics are easy to do because they kind of irradiate when they're hit with X-rays, whereas the metals, you actually have to do a full spectral analysis on the metals. And when we're doing super alloys, there could be 7 components that have overlapping composition, and one has 0.3% molybdenum in it, and another alloy, let's say Hastelloy XYZ, and the other one that you have to sort has just a little bit of one element being different, and you have to find that element and then sort it automatically. And we were able to do that with funding from the Advanced Technology Program. We got about $7 or $8 million from ATP and TIP, and we got about another $15 million from the SBIR program. We and our team members to put this technology together. Using optoelectronics to sort materials, that was our game plan. It's still in formation. We haven't succeeded yet. You try to match the X-ray images of 2 materials. So one of the technologies uses image matching. Other ones actually do a full analytical analysis, and I won't go through that with you. Turbine blades and chips for machining aircraft alloys. This was a facility online at a production plant processing those materials. And we also have technology called melt cognition now, which can analyze molten metals instantaneously. So you don't have to take samples and go to the lab and freeze them and cut them and grind them and do a spectral analysis and then come back and make composition changes. You can do it real time with instantaneous information about melt composition. And that's information too. What I would tell you is that my experience is that arriving at the technology and getting the technology to work in a pilot plant is about 35% of the innovation cost. Is getting a pilot plant working and making product and producing product that people will buy and pay for. And that the other 65% is scale up and insertion into existing manufacturing facilities and overcoming labor barriers, like the one problem that we had when people use these handheld spark analysis to analyze these metals. There are labor negotiations about if you replace them with a machine, that's a problem. And frankly, the workers really want to see this equipment fail. So inserting this new technology into an existing running facility is a huge part of the economic cost of innovation and becoming commercial. Maybe we can talk about other things.
Absolutely. So before we take questions, I know we're a little over. We, so this is a small token of appreciation. This is a innovation lecture class. It is a little heavy.
I'm not going to recycle that. Just
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. And so now
Yes.
So the way I see it, the burden is like really unbalanced. So like companies are allowed to put products in whatever product, like whatever plastic they want, and then the consumer basically has to sort of figure out like what to do with it, right? And we're like super limited. So the town I live in, they sent a letter out to when they were saying they're not taking number 1, number 2 plastics because of the thing in China. So you have all of
Actually, it's not China.
Okay.
It's really what we've done in the United States, but go ahead.
So why can't we just limit what the companies, like limit the materials that they're able to use instead of having to come up with new technologies to recycle all these materials that they're putting all the products in instead? Like why can't we just mandate what the companies are allowed to do instead of like just putting the burden on me knowing I have to throw this in a landfill because there's nothing I can do about it, right?
So the answer is we can do that. And Germany does that with the Green Dot program. And there's sustainability manufacturing requirements in Germany that are very clear, that even the auto windshields have to be recycled or you can't sell the car. So there are huge incentives to recycle what is made and create the markets or not manufacture, which is a huge cost to the auto manufacturers, let's say. So it can be done. The only thing that I would say is it's not the American way.
Yeah, well, because it could affect their profits, right? If they have to spend more.
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest issues that we face are not technical, I don't think. I think they're getting the political mandate to do the right things, where who gets to decide what's right, okay? So you might say that, and somebody else say, hey, it's all about the money, we have to compete with these guys. And how are we going to sell our cars in China if China's not doing that, blah, blah, blah. And, this is a gunslinging, free market society, and America is a difficult place. People are already, angry at the left for putting too many restrictions on. And I would tell you that it's my opinion, not to be political here, but I think some of the things that Trump has done with EPA needed to be done long ago. And believe me, I'm an environmentalist, I'm a technical guy and all that, and my heart is in recycling. But sometimes we just really over-regulate and do the wrong thing. So I would say that. I would say that it could be done, and you can make it be done if the will of the people is such that it becomes a priority. That's what it takes. That's the hardest part.
I was going to say too that it was a great talk. I really did.
Thank you.
Another question?
Yes.
This is kind of another spin on who decides what's right. So now, when you buy big packages of water at a supermarket, you open the package and the water bottle barely stands up on its own. It's so thin. It's so flammable. Why do we do that?
Okay. Well, first off, because we don't like that, because when we get that bottle back, it doesn't weigh anything. It's like buying air, right? So it's Nestle, really, who's doing that on the water bottles. They're the ones who are producing the water bottles that are so thin, they're paper thin, okay? And then if you look at Coke and Pepsi, they'll put more into the marketing so the cheap bottles are, and then the bottles you pay $1.50 for out of the vending machines, it's not the ones you're talking about. Those have a fair amount of plastic, they hold their shape, and they have a lot of marketing, imaging and logo and everything that's preserved. So I don't think we can't control it. We don't like the thin models, but I don't know that we can do anything but let that work in its free market. The only thing you can do is not buy it. I mean, you know, the one thing that they listen to is the money. And if you don't like it, you know, there are other options out there. It's not like everything's that way, but you have to pay up for those other features that you want. Am I right or not?
Yeah, no, it's,
You mentioned a statistic early on that we produce 4.5 pounds per day of waste per person. Does that also include the compostable organics, banana peels, kitchen waste? Is that included in the 4.5 pounds per day?
No, anything that goes into composting or recycling is excluded, and that's why the
Okay.
solid waste numbers started to level out.
Okay.
As the recycling numbers went up, and those recycling numbers include compostables, yard waste, it's recycled. The one thing that is not in there though, is you know, when we process material, we don't get 100% recyclable from what we buy. So there's waste made there, but that would be considered commercial or industrial waste.
Okay.
But it's really residential waste after going through recycling processes.
Other question?
One more question. So the PET has been doing so well, I mean 6 nines. Are there any scientific challenge behind of this PET plastic recycling?
Well, our facility to recycle this PET
Right.
is 350,000 square feet. That is a big plant. I mean, that's a pretty big plant. And there is a lot of technology in that. And I will tell you that PET, the kinds of things that we have to do, you know, we have to sort by color almost perfectly. It has to be all PET. There can't be any PVC. There can't be any metals. 0% metals. So if you saw what we do for metal sortation,
Right.
it's like unbelievable. And then the other thing is that PET, if there's any moisture that gets into it, the PVC breaks the polymer chains. That's one, and it also colors it red. But the other thing is moisture will break the polymer chains. So we have to almost process in vacuum in order to not have the moisture that's in the environment break down the polymer chains in PET. And then on top of that, at the end, what we call the intrinsic viscosity, the melt viscosity, like either it flows like honey or it flows like water. The intrinsic viscosity of the product we make has to be dead on with virgin material, okay? And to do that, we have to rebuild the polymer through solid stating. So we have to put them into solid stating devices that at high temperatures allow molecules to join together again in order to move the intrinsic viscosity up to virgin quality. And it's only after all that is done in a moisture-free environment that, you know, we can sell it. And then of course you have the issues of building customer confidence in your quality.
Got it. So then the catalyst will be very important to break down this PET to monomers.
The what would be?
Catalyst. Do you need a catalyst? to
No.
break-
No, remember, we're built, the catalyst to break it down can be PVC contamination or water, right? Water vapor. We have to build it up. And we do that we try to preserve it from falling down in our processing, having very short melt extrusion times, and then also solid stating afterwards in order to get to the virgin quality.
Got it.
So it's rough. I mean, it's a rough game. And what doesn't meet spec, then we sell down into lower grade markets. And as I said, that would be polyester fiber, that would be engineered resins, that would be, I mean, we never get to plastic wood, but, you know, that would be stuff like, you know, the fillers in your ski jackets, and probably the lowest grade would be poly, you know, because PET is really polyester. So it's, you know, would be the fiber in your upholstery in your house. That would be kind of the lowest grade product. We don't make anything that's worse than that,
I see. Thank you.
even on a bad day.
Other questions? So let me ask you one question. So you mentioned that technologies exist to recycle most things, but they're not cost effective. So the real gap here is coming up with technologies which are cost effective. Is that the,
No, there's a second one, which is meeting manufacturer quality standards, which, you know, getting back to your question, the manufacturers are not willing to drop their quality standards an iota for recycled content. I mean, we make really sophisticated stuff here in America, and we've really got to be on the quality numbers. So quality, and then why does it cost so much? Because convincing them that your quality in large scale and consistently is not going to upset their manufacturing apple cart.
right?
Because everybody's fighting over pennies, particularly in chemical processing.
All right, let us thank David once again.
Well, thank you. It's nice to meet you. I wish you a lot of luck. I mean, I gotta